All right, y'all. So again, welcome. I am Taliba Obuya with the Malcolm X Grassroots movement and a part of our gender and sexual justice committee inside of the org. And we're here to have a dope conversation around like, yo, let's be real. Black radical feminists, critiques of the empire. Um, we are excited to be here in this space tonight. And so just a little bit of why we gather and why we here. June Jordan, the June Jordan, check her out, mad dope, right? She writes in Where is the Love in 1978 that when she speaks of Black feminism, she is speaking from an intense consciousness of truth. And so tonight we gather for a discussion that meditates on Black radical feminist criticisms of the empire in both the US and an international context. I'm excited to have our MXGM Philly organizer and artist, Avi Soul, will engage in discourse with four identified Black radical feminists. We have Chrystel Oloukoï, ángel, Monaye Johnson, and Jay Lonnie. And as the world is always situated with a dire political context, the Black radical feminist tradition calls for organization, study, and truth. And so as we consider today and tomorrow, this discussion seeks to unify as we confront the wages of the empire and to combat liberalism within this tradition of Black radical feminist practice and study. So I said a mouthful, but the conversation definitely will be full and lit tonight. And so just excited for that. Before we jump in, I do want to share like who we are as the Malcolm X Grassroots movement. And so the Malcolm X Grassroots movement is an organization of Black and New Africans whose mission is ultimately to defend the human rights of our people and to promote self-determination in our communities. We understand that collective institutions of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism has been at the root of our people's oppression. So thus we understand that without control of these things, we will fall victim to genocide. We organize around 6 principles. We defend the human rights of all African people, the entire New African nation, and internationally. We oppose genocide. We demand reparations. We promote self-determination. We are here to free political prisoners, prisoners of war, and political exiles. And then we also demand an ending to gender and ending gender and sexual oppression. We do this work through 8 chapters across the country. That's in Oakland, that's in Chicago, we in Detroit, in Jackson, in Atlanta, DC, and Philly, and New York. And so we are always on the lookout for Black people who love Black people, who are aligned with these principles of unity, and who believe in our right to self-determination, land, and independence. And so without further ado, that's where this is the framework in which we want to unite and bring our folks in. I want to hand it over to my comrade, Sakarja, to tell you a little bit more around the Gender and Sexual Justice Committee that is bringing forth this program tonight.
All right, free the land, everybody. My name is Sakarja. I'm an organizing member with the Philly chapter, and I'm also a part of the Gender and Sexual Justice Committee. So I'm going to say a little bit more about what the committee is and the work that we do. As a working committee, the purpose of the Gender and Sexual Justice Committee is to ground the work of shaping the culture of MXGM that relates to the concerns of new African genders and sexualities. As a grounding measure, MXGM benefits from embodying gender and sexual-based analytics to understand how to support new Africans as a way to develop critiques of settler colonial impositions of anti-Blackness, patriarchy, sex, gender, and sexuality. This committee uses the political frameworks of womanism, Black queer feminism, Black transness, Black queerness, reproductive justice, Black ecologies, gender anarchism, disability, and sexual and libidinal economies. All right, and with that, I will introduce the moderator for today, Ivy Soul, and these are their words. So this is Ivy in their own words. I'm a Black Southerner turned Philadelphian, born and raised just outside of New Africa's borders in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm a working artist making music, film, and visual art in collaboration with my loved ones. We say what we mean, and we mean what we say. We want to contribute to the cultural revolution necessary for African liberation and self-determination, with special regard for trans, queer, disabled Africans and African children. I'm a member of the Philadelphia chapter of MXGM, former member of the now defunct Tegadelti Mau Mau Reading Circle, and the United Musicians and Allied Workers Union. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ivy.
Yo, what's good? Free the land, everyone. Thank you so much, Sakarja, for introducing me. Like Sakarja was saying, I'm a Black Southerner, was born and raised in so-called Charlotte, North Carolina, on Waxhaw territory. And I'm really, really stoked to be here today. Want to welcome everyone to the space and just like ground us in, a moment of celebration that Black August is now closed, but like the work is still on a move. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have such brilliant minds that are joining me this evening, or evening for the East Coast anyway. So first up, we have Chrystel Oloukoï. And Chrystel is an artist, film critic, and curator broadly interested in experimental cinema, queer cinema, and Black continental and diasporic cinema. They hold a PhD in African and African American Studies from Harvard University and work at the University of Washington as an assistant professor of geography. Their work engages imaginations of the night in Lagos, as well as the afterlives of colonial technologies of temporal discipline. So, welcome, Chrystel. Next up, we have Jaylani. Jaylani, they, them, is a 26-year-old Black queer Muslim writer, abortion doula, and community builder based in the greater Atlanta metro area, with several years of experience in grassroots organizing, storytelling, and community reproductive care service. Jaylani is also the co-founder and co-steward of the Trans Futures Collective, an emerging community of queer and trans reproductive care workers resisting anti-Black and anti-trans violence wherever it exists. They also act as community doula with the Adaya Collective, a tight-knit group of Muslims providing support, love, and dua for Muslims throughout their pregnancy ending journeys. So welcome to Jelani. Next up, we have Ángel. Ángel is a Black trans and queer feminist, anti-disciplinary cultural worker, and community organizer with the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement DC chapter, currently based in Washington, DC. Their work intertwines Black radical feminist thought and radical queer theories through expansive, creative, literary methods and experimental film video making. I just want to welcome the panelists. We are awaiting our second panelist, or our fourth panelist, Monaye, and I'll introduce Monaye once Monaye joins us. Everyone ready to move forward? Excellent. So this question is for all the panelists. Black feminist scholar Hortense J. Spillers, in a conversation with Margot Natalie Crawford, once discussed what practitioners of Black study must remain committed to within the tradition of Black studies. She said, Black studies is now a full house, a formation that comes out as protest in the morning that in any moment could turn dangerous. It must never forget that. It cannot get too comfortable. Black studies, that hybrid element that is always riding that paradox. I would like to think that every generation of Black studies will renew itself to task. Otherness has an advantage. You do not have to be the same as the environment. Black studies can't lose its foreignness or otherness. So actually, if folks in the audience are like our participants, I can also read that one more time if that would be helpful. I know for me sometimes auditory learning isn't my main jam, so I'm just gonna read that one more time. Black studies is now a full house, a formation that comes out as protests in the morning that in any moment could turn dangerous. It must never forget that. It cannot get too comfortable. Black studies, that hybrid element that is always riding that paradox. I would like to think that every generation of Black studies will renew itself to task. Otherness has an advantage. You do not have to be the same as the environment. Black studies can't lose its foreignness or otherness. So I want to just begin the program by asking all of you this. If we were to adjust Dr. Spiller's language about Black studies with Black feminism, then what exactly would you say Black feminism is? And what would it mean to keep Black feminism, particularly as a radical formation, dangerous, principled, and other? Yeah, and that's for any of the three of y'all.
I can start by breaking the ice. Thank you for posing that question, Comrade Ivy. I believe by replacing Black feminism with, or Black studies with Black feminism, I feel like it is a responsibility for us to steward the tradition of Black radical feminism, especially from those who have paved the way for us and built the foundations of Black radical feminisms. And even thinking about how a lot of them have died early deaths, unfortunately. And knowing that had they been like Black liberal feminists or were assimilationist or conformist careerists, then they probably would have lived longer because they would have had access to like resources to help them deal with certain like health ailments and illnesses. And I also think that by us continuing to steward this, that we are protecting it from the state's co-optation. We are protecting it from being erased because we know that unfortunately so many other like theories and ideologies have been erased due to COINTELPRO, due to other counterinsurgent methods. And yeah, I don't want, like me personally, I don't want like Black radical feminisms to be revised or erased in any way, shape, or form. I'm also just always thinking about like how when folks talk about like the revolution, how did other nations that experienced revolution and also experiencing genocide and other forms of imperial oppression, like how were they able to maintain and archive their artifacts, whether it be through like history books or thinking about what just happened in Sudan with one of their museums being looted, having all their artifacts looted, and like where's that going to end up? And who's going to be able to tell that story, right? So I think for us to continue to keep Black radical feminism dangerous and keeping it othered, that we are also providing like a guiding tool for the next generation to continue this work and also build out like the world that they want to see through principled solidarity, struggle, and organizing.
Thank you so much, Angel. Chrystel, Jaylani, either of you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can go next. Thank you, Angel. I really appreciate your answer. When you ask that question, I think it brings to mind many conversations I've had with Zalika, who is also part of MGMX. And something that I've learned from her and with her is that the project of policing the borders of Black feminism, of what is and what is not Black feminism, is not always a very fruitful project, and that Black feminism has always been, from its inception, a very divided house, a full house in Spiller's formulation, with a lot of like assimilationist or what we would today call neoliberal tendencies, but also radical tendencies. So I don't really have like, the more time passes, the less I have a kind of like prescriptive definition of what Black feminism is. But I know that what I identify with as an organizer and as a theoretician is a tradition of Black feminism that is at its core, um, opposed to nations, nationhood, and borders. And I'm thinking about June Jordan's book of essay, Civil Wars, whose subtitle is From the Front Lines of America, and thinking about that position in whichever imperial core one is situated in, may it be the US, or for me, at times France, but now the US. Thinking about that position as a position at the front lines rather than a position of like being a citizen, and what that means to take seriously that one is at war with the state. And a lot of the people I keep going back to and reading, as the Combahee River Collective, George Jackson, etc., those are people who called their situation within the United States as that of being part of an internal colony. So I'm really trying to think about this, thinking about colonization and empire, not as just like inside and outside, but really as all of us occupying different positions within empire, but none of us being outside of it and outside of its violence. And I think that's what Black feminism brings to me. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. I may have to say more after, but yeah, I think that's a good start.
I think it's an excellent start. Thank you so much, Jaylani.
Thank you both for going first. Definitely echo everything that's been said. And I think that what I'm going to say is probably aligned closely in a lot of ways already, but I genuinely, in the last couple of months in particular, feel like so much of the trouble that we find ourselves in is because of the lack of clarity about what exactly Black feminism is as a discipline, as a critical framework, which means that we're then not able to, at least with the rigor that I think that we should be able to, distinguish Black feminisms, plural. And so even though I don't think that these like Black liberal feminisms, imperial feminisms, carceral feminisms are ideologies that the masses hold, like I think history shows us that that's not the case. They don't need to be held by the masses in order to pose real threats to our dignity and our safety. And so I think that in trying to then define Black feminism, I would preoccupy myself with trying to be really clear and concise about decolonial, anti-colonial Black feminisms. And so I'm really glad that we started with June Jordan, because I think a lot about a quote from one of her books of essays, Uncallable Essays, where she writes, like a lot of Black women, I've always had to invent the power my freedom requires. And so I think that Black feminisms at their very best are us as Black gender marginalized folks creating new forms of power, because we've identified that the forms of power that we're told to aspire to, that are constantly kind of like dangled in front of us, are not going to create freedom. Like at most, we can, sink our teeth into a little piece of that power, whether it's based on colorism, featureism, national identity, whatever it is. And like maybe for a little while, it's like a sigh of relief, but you can't hold on to it that long because it's not guaranteed. And so I think that what really has been grounding me, because I think we're also obviously in a moment where a lot of that power is being dangled in front of us, and we're supposed to look at the vice president and be like, that could be me too for some reason. You can only be what she is, and I think that should be the critique in and of itself. I shouldn't actually have to say more like, I can only be what she is. And do I want that? What does that mean for Black people? What does that do for Black people? Does what she is, and that's it.
Amazing. I'm so stoked. One thing that I wanted to just note for folks is that something that all three of our panelists have touched on to a certain extent is just the necessary for like the material to be like at the forefront of Black feminism as we're thinking about it, and the material being like kind of not just lived experience, but kind of the economic and the social like facts and truths that kind of like encircle all of these like highbrow theories. And I think particularly what Jelani said about the masses like not agreeing with a lot of the feminisms that have been used against us is something that I'm just like really grateful to be hearing outside of my own brain for sure. This next question is for Chrystel. And I'd like to talk to you for a second and think about the Black mother figure. We're going to play and read some excerpts regarding the Black mother figure and the perception surrounding them. And this first audio excerpt is June Jordan's poem "Getting Down to Get Over" from her 1974 poetry collection New Days: Poems of Exile and Return, 1970 to 1972. The part that we're going to play is a song rendition performed by Bernice Johnson Reagan called "A Tribute to June Jordan." Ibaile and Tonu to both of them. May they both rest in eternal peace. So let's just hear that now.
Consider the queen, and on her hip, sweat resting from the corn-bean greens field, steamy under the pale, sly, suffocating sun. Consider the queen. She fixed the
Not Harvard blocking.
shirt and fry some chicken, bake some cake, and tell the family, never mind about the boss man. Don't know how a human being's supposed to act. Just never mind about him. Wash your face, sit down, and let the good Lord bless this table. Consider the queen. She works when she works in the laundry, in jail, in the schoolhouse, in jail, in the office, in jail, on the soapbox, in jail, on the desk, on the floor, on the street, on the line, at the door, looking fine at the head of the line, stepping sharp from behind in the light, with a song, wearing boots or a belt and a gun, drinking wine when it's time, when the long week is done. But she works when she works in the laundry, in jail. She works when she works. Consider the queen. Now that's June Jordan.
I'm going to read the other part of that poem by June and then follow it up with a quote really quickly and then actually get to the question that I'd love to speak with you about. Mama Black, Mama, Black woman, Black, female head of household, Black matriarchal matriarchy, Black statistical, low life, low level, low down, and up to be low down. Black statistical, low factor, factotum, factitious, fictitious, figment, figuring in low down lion annual reports. Black woman, Black, hallelujah, saintly, patient, smiling, humble, giving thanks for annual reports and monthly dole and Friday night and good God, Monday morning, Black and female, martyr, masochist, a big white lie, mama, mama. I'm also going to read this excerpt from Jennifer Nash's Birthing Black Mothers. Where the long-standing conditions of the ordinary have been newly framed as a crisis, and where Black motherhood itself has become a site of cultural interest, empathy, fascination, support, and seemingly benign regulation, both by the biopolitical state and by Black feminists, as they have collaborated to figure Black mothers as living in crisis. This book argues that Black mothers in the United States have become spectacularly and dangerously visible through the frame of crisis, one that insists on their spatial and temporal location in a death world that is described as reminiscent of the nation's imagined past, even as it is consistent with the conditions of the unfolding present. While crisis has made the precarity of Black mothering newly visible, if not remediable, it has also tethered Black maternal flesh to disorder, even if it is not the disorder of earlier eras, namely pathology and poverty. It is precisely because Black motherhood is now cast as suffering rather than pathological, as tragic rather than self-destructive, as traumatized rather than deviant, that the crisis frame can both be deeply seductive and rhetorically effective. Yet the rhetoric of crisis is part of an enduring and troubling tradition of rendering Black women generally and Black mothers specifically into symbols, even if now Black mothers are symbols of tragic heroism rather than deviance. So in April, actress and TV host Drew Barrymore said to VP and presidential candidate Kamala Harris, "I keep thinking in my head that we all need a mom. I've been thinking that we all need a tremendous hug in the world right now. But in our country, we need you to be Mamala of the country." The idea is that Kamala, as the mother figurehead, will save her children meaning so-called democracy or the US citizen. Can you speak to the Black mother figure in the context of US empire for us?
I'm trying to recover from hearing that quote again. Yeah, I think I was trying to think about like how to even start with that question. I think the one thing I wanted to start with is, before I go more in depth about the figure of the mother, is start with a kind of like disavowal of that metaphor whereby a lot of people who are not in the Black feminist tradition would see that metaphor of Kamala, the president, being called a mother as a kind of like confusion of scales, and a state where you can't think about the state that is just like huge scale at the scale of the family, which is the scale of the mother. And I think this kind of dismissal of that metaphor for me does not work. And it's actually one of the gifts of Black feminism, to think very deeply about the intrication and the entanglement between those very different scales, and the ways in which the borders between private and public, between the house and the field, between the domestic and the international, between the core of empire and its margins, all of those binaries are actually very connected. So I want to start with like the fact that this quote feels like a joke, but also that I think one of the things that Black feminism teaches us is to take those metaphors very, very seriously, and not as distractions from something else. So that I want to like quote something else that's as ridiculous, and I apologize in advance. But there was this like video clip that went TikTok viral for a hot second at the beginning, I think, of 2021. So before Drew Barrymore, which was this like young white woman who, in her car, saying that there's nothing that makes her feel better in life than hearing an old Black woman call her baby. And she says more explicitly, "There's so much power. What kind of magic are you putting in there? Because that shit is harder than crack. I've never felt more loved and supported in my entire life. Like, are you my mother?" And there was a lot of like careful like prefatory statements around that. But I do think that both that statement by this young woman and what Drew Barrymore says to Kamala Harris speaks to what we know to be this kind of like mammy figure, but those kind of like monstrous intimacies, to borrow from Christina Sharp formulation, that emerge from a history of slavery and enslavement, and a history of harnessing the reproductive and care capacities of Black women in service of the reproduction of the white household, and by extension, the reproduction of the state and the imperial state. I want to read a short excerpt from Saidiya Hartman's The Belly of the World, and I'm also going to put in the chat for accessibility, where she described this ambivalence of Black women's conscription to motherhood. Her lover, her spouse, and her kin depend on this labor for their subsistence, as does her community. As a consequence, she comes to enjoy a position that is revered and reviled, essential to the endurance of Black social life, and at the same time blamed for its destruction. The care extracted from her to tend the white household is taken at the cost of her own. She is the best nanny and the worst mother, yet this labor remains marginal or neglected in the narratives of Black insurgency, resistance, and refusal. So that to that video about this TikTok user, there was like a deluge of comments by other white women narrating similar experiences in relation to Black women. And what I want to point here is that we could think about this naming of Kamala Harris as a mother figure, as this kind of like very like ultra contemporary instantiation of like a kind of like neoliberal Black feminism. But I think we can more productively think about this metaphor as part of a troubling continuum of a US empire that has always looted Black women's care capacities via colonization, enslavement, domestic work, etc., and always harnessed it for its own benefit. So in those metaphors, there's a lot of romanticization of what a mother is, and mother as a category, and the relationship to mothers. And I think the quote that you have with Jennifer Nash kind of like alludes to that, this kind of celebration of mothers that a lot of Black feminists have engaged with, because maternity and mothering is also a side of historical injury. And there is a need to reclaim this kind of erased and disavowed labor. But at the same time, that kind of reclaiming can also be co-opted for imperial purposes. And I've had especially a lot of difficulties with that kind of romanticization, because if we speak seriously, a lot of us have very ambivalent relationship to mothers, to our Black mothers, and especially if we think about existing in an anti-Black world, that figure of disciplining, the first disciplinarian oftentimes emerge as the Black mother. And especially for the Black queer child, it's even more a more fraught relationship. But what I want to ask is that if Black mothers, Black women as mothers are tasked with this duty to save the nation, what does it say about its citizens if we leave the figure of the Black woman with just a pretext for that metaphor, and to think about what it serves, what kind of purposes does it serve for the people who are leveraging that metaphor? I think there is a kind of like psychic comfort, especially for whiteness. But here I want us to think about whiteness in expanded terms and think about the figure of the citizen in an imperial context as an extension of whiteness. And the corollary of the Black mother is a white child. The white child is this individual that is always in a state of perpetual innocence of what is done in its name, and a perpetual state of infantilization, which allows one to benefit from a system of inequality while putting the burden of change, of that order of things, on others. So we can think about this figure of the Black mother as another kind of ruse to innocence, and white rules to innocence specifically, and by extension, citizenship rules to innocence, where the US citizen absolves itself from its responsibilities of what the US does in its borders and outside of its borders by calling on that figure of the mother who is going to solve everything and save the nation. But what I find especially fascinating about that inscription or that metaphor on Kamala Harris is I don't think that she's actually trying to perform that cliche or that trope of the Black mother. And she's actually very invested in kind of calling into more like martial traditions of leadership, of Black leadership, that goes with a kind of like military and police tradition. But regardless of her own gendered performance and her own performance of leadership, that mothering figure is also being read unto her. But I'm thinking about her in relation to like other figures such as Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice, for instance. And I do think that even if there is this kind of like martial aspect to her own presentation, I do think that that's when the metaphor of the mother becomes especially more dangerous, because it also has this kind of like softening element of what she represents and what she is and what she does in service of the US empire. So I'm thinking about Kamala Harris more as a comprador rather than as a mother. And comprador is a term that I borrow from Fanon, but also from Joy James. So Fanon calls the kind of like national bourgeoisie of liberation movement. Sorry, I'm laughing at the bombala. The kind of like national bourgeoisies of decolonization movements who are interested not necessarily in throwing down the colonial order, but just in like taking the reins out of white hands, just changing spots, but not changing the fundamental order of things. As for Joy James, she talks about compradors as operatives for capital, empire, policing, and prison. Compradors are not caretakers for oppressed communities. They function as and with predators against caretakers. The comprador stabilizes the colony not out of love, but out of ego and greed. They willingly work on behalf of predatory corporations and state bureaucracies. They support militarism, cadaver capitalism, destruction of other life forms and the organic environment. I'm also going to put that quote in the chat. So I think that's all I had to say about the figure of the mother, thinking about this ambiguity as a metaphor that is read into her, but that she's not performing, but also what it obscures and how it also gives her a different kind of power in terms of this present liberal moment. Thank you.
Spectacular. Truly spectacular. The only thing that I would love to add is there's a book by Max Horkheimer called Studies on Authority in the Family that speaks pretty in depth about fascism as like about the family, the Western conception of family as the first site of fascism. Like that's many people in the West's first introduction to authoritarianism. So I think that you're spot on by saying that Kamala being read. Yeah, I'll put the source in the chat. But Kamala being read as a parent is like a rhetorical maneuver that gives her that much more authoritarian power, because now you're intimated to her as less of a politician and less as a top cop and less as a human in general with flaws, but more in a deified way as a cult of personality and literally as a parent. So thank you so much, Chrystel, for bringing all those things together. I'm going to take a moment away from the questions really quickly to welcome and celebrate that our fourth panelist has arrived. Thank you so much, Monaye. Monaye Johnson is a master's recipient of gender studies from GWU and a PhD student in Africana studies at Brown. She is an organizer, trainer, cultural worker, and writer. Her work looks at reproductive justice, care ethics, and Black feminisms. She runs the Instagram account Black Readings to Heal, exploring the writings of Black folks as a healing modality. So thank you so much for popping out, Monaye.
Thank you for having me. I'm so sorry I was late.
No, time is a Western conception. Don't even worry about that. Don't even worry. I actually do have a question for Angel before we get to your question, Monaye. So shout out to my comrade, Angel. Big GSJC vibes in the building. And thank you to Chrystel for like setting up this question so beautifully. Joy James writes in Radicalizing Black Feminism the following: some Black feminisms explicitly challenge state and corporate dominance and critique the privileged status of bourgeois elites among the left. Those that do so by connecting political theory for radical transformation with political acts to abolish corporate state and elite dominance are revolutionary. Differentiating between liberalism and radicalism, or even more so between radical and revolutionary, to theorize Black feminist liberation politics is extremely difficult, but essential for understanding some limitations of left politics and Black feminisms. Part of the difficulty in delineating the left of Black feminism stems from the resurgence of the right and its modification of liberal and progressive thought. Neo-radicalism, like liberalism, denounces draconian measures against women, poor and racialized peoples, and similarly, it positions itself as a loyal opposition to the state. Therefore, what it denounces is not the state itself, but its excesses: prison exploitation and torture, punitive measures towards the poor, environmental degradation, counter-revolutionary violence, and contra-wars. Abolition movements directed by neo-radicals rarely extend their rhetoric to call for the abolition of capitalism and the corporate state. When led or advocated by those representative of the disenfranchised, the de-radicalizing tendencies are muted by the appearance of the symbolic radical. Angel, Black feminism is absolutely a spectrum, and what we've come to understand about this tradition is that it has many faces, layers, and facets. There are Black feminists who are very much concerned with the protectionist rhetorics and practices of what it means to protect and defend Black women. Even in terms of this federal election, there are feminist rhetorics that are centered around a cult of personality, for example, crafting feminisms around celebrities like Beyonce or even Megan Thee Stallion. We've come to know and understand the misrepresentations of identity politics and how the misrepresentation has been scapegoated as a liberal and a historical site of endangerment for Black people by way of the Black family within the Black radical tradition. The hailing and overrepresentation of Black feminism as a liberal project has become a central thesis for those who tout it as thereby useless and harmful to our movements, which discounts the radicalized capabilities of Black feminism, such as Black anti-imperialist and internationalist notions of feminism. So, Angel, could you share what a Black anti-imperialist feminist is within the tradition of Black feminism and why that might be obfuscated or distorted by the state and our current movements?
Yes, thank you for that, Comrade Ivy. Also the Megan Thee Stallion of it all. My heart, but you can't win them all. For me, anti-imperialist Black feminism is very different than the Black feminism that we're seeing in mainstream media, social media. I personally believe that it is someone who is committed to dismantling the empire as well as imperialism, not just in Turtle Island, but abroad, because we all know that like US hegemony is unfortunately spread throughout just about every place that the US has its tentacles in. So it only makes sense for us who are in the empire, right? Whether we agree with being American citizens, whether we identify as Black or New African, we still have a responsibility to not just our nation, but also other colonized and oppressed nations within the US and abroad to fight the belly of the beast that we're living in. We do understand we have certain privileges, right, with this citizenship that's been imposed onto a lot of us who were born here and even some of our ancestors. And that the only way, instead of being like, oh, like I'm just going to like go to Ghana or I'm just going to go to like Bali whenever Trump gets elected and not stay here and struggle, is very selfish, in my personal opinion, and also cowardice, because just because like you're in another country doesn't mean that you're not going to experience sexism, you're not going to experience racism, anti-Blackness, or whatnot. So why not stay where a lot of these oppressions have been created and continue to be perpetuated? Why not stay and dismantle that? And it's also a form of solidarity, principal solidarity, with other feminist movements that are in alignment with anti-imperialist and radical Black feminism. Yeah, by trying to, yeah, it's just, once again, like maybe going on like a delegation trip, getting to know other like decolonial feminists, other anti-imperialist feminists, and also understanding their perspective, and not just coming in with like, okay, this is how we're doing it in Turtle Island, so this is how y'all got to do it, because that's not going to be effective. We have to figure out how it is that we can learn from one another, how we can experiment with putting these theories that we're all studying and learning, and like some of us are scholars of, into actual tangible practice, using the method of organizing, right? So that we can actually see real change, so that we can actually be dedicated to the struggle, the protracted struggle of liberation, and really just collective liberation. Um, yeah, anti-imperialist feminism. It's, I'm still learning from so many other anti-imperialist feminists. When I was brought into the concept of feminism, I was in I want to say my second semester of college. And yeah, I had a white professor, I feel like a lot of folks, and also Tumblr, right? And it was actually Tumblr that really like helped to introduce me to so many other like Black radical feminists. Because for a very long time, I was like, okay, like y'all are, I'm with it. Like I love Black feminism. However, why aren't we talking about those who are incarcerated? Why aren't we talking about those who are living on the streets? Why aren't we talking about those who have been locked away in quote unquote mental asylums? Why aren't we talking about those who are working class, low income, and also participating in libidinal economies? And that is when I started to learn the difference between Black liberal feminism, Black imperialist feminism, Black anti-imperialist feminisms. And so I also think it's very important, especially right now, that we be very intentional about making a distinction between the type of Black feminisms that we are in alignment with, because we see, unfortunately, the state co-opting a lot of this, right? So it's like anyone just get like, oh, I'm a Black feminist. And you're like, okay, so what else? Like, what type? Like, I know, like, amongst y'all, I can be like, yeah, I'm a Black feminist, and y'all get it. I don't have to explain. However, if I go outside and I'm like, yeah, I'm a Black feminist, right? Or I wear my Black women radicals, like Black feminists taught me hat when I'm out and about, people look at me like, oh, so you want to emasculate Black men? And it's like, no, that's not it. That's not it at all. So yeah, it's like we have to be very once again, like intentional, because yeah, the state, down with the empire, however, their propaganda is very effective. I got to give them that, unfortunately. And then also, I think by us making these distinctions, we can have conversations with one another, and helping folks to unlearn a lot of the misconceptions that they've internalized about Black radical feminism and even Black anti-imperialist feminisms. And in that way, we don't get like folks who are not from the US, right? Being like, oh, you're a Black feminist, so that means you're in alignment with Kamala, because Kamala doesn't even identify as a feminist. Like, and I want to shout out Jaleesa Jackson for talking about that in their recent interview with Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, one of the co-founders of the Decolonial Feminist Collective. It's like, yeah, she doesn't even identify as that. People just gave that to her. Like they just put that on her, right? And I even think about with Hillary Clinton too. Like a lot of white feminists were like, yes, I'm with her, da 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 da. But she's not even a white feminist because this is the same woman who's responsible for the upheaval that we see now in Honduras, right, under the Obama administration when she was Secretary of State. So I think it's very important for us to be mindful about what we mean when we say, oh, this person is a Black feminist, right? What does Black radical feminism mean? What does Black anti-imperialist feminism mean? What does decolonial feminism mean, right? And be very adamant about making sure that we protect it and guard it as best as possible, because we are up against, like, we're up against a lot right now. We're seeing it with like our education system, with a lot of these like things such as like critical race theory, right? Or even like history of African Americans, right, being literally like taken out of curriculums. So we have to get very creative with how we can continue to, like I said earlier, just like steward this tradition of Black anti-imperialist feminisms. And then to the second part of the question, of why movements and the state, was it why do they disrupt them? Or why do they not, what was it?
It's why might Black anti-imperialist feminism be like distorted by the state? And like to be honest, it's like even within like the wider left movement.
Oh, okay, thank you for that. Yeah, I feel like with the wider left movement, I've only been an organizer for 3 years now, because September is my third year. Yeah, okay. So from what I've seen so far in my short period of time of like being in the movement, is that I feel like there's a lot of miseducation, unfortunately. Miseducation, chauvinism, sexism, misogynarism. um, I was actually talking to Z the other day. We were having a conversation. We were saying like how a lot of Black radical and like anti-imperialist feminists who came before us were not misandrous, as people like to call them, but they were actually like, hey, like Black man, like I love you. However, you're messing up, and this is how you can course correct that. And then also like acknowledging that they may be internalizing certain like colonial practices and social conditions, right? Such as like cis heteropatriarchy, such as internalized like sexism, right? And like how could we work together to unlearn that and not pass that on to the next generation? However, I can only make an assumption, but it feels like a lot of Black men did not like that because of their own like internalized patriarchy, because of chauvinism. And then you even get folks who are like, well, I don't want to talk about that because it doesn't talk about like the Black family. But then once again, what do we mean when we say that, like the Black family, as Chrystel was just saying? When we think about family within the West, it is one of the first forms and examples of fascism, especially the nuclear family model. And yeah, I just really think that a lot of people are resistant to learning, like to wanting to unlearn, right? And actually engage in the practice of decolonization, because it's going to make them have to really struggle with and contend with a lot of things that are actually not in alignment with some of the ideologies that they may say that they're upholding, right? You have to actually ask yourself, like, how have I been sexist, right? How has like patriarchy shown up in my behaviors, in my relationships? Where does it come from? And I just think a lot of folks are not willing to do that work because it's hard work, but we have to do it together. We have to be like principled about it as well. And then I think with the state, I feel like with every like movement or like theory or ideology that challenges them, that is the antithesis of them, they want to try to find any way that they can to either co-opt it or completely destroy it and eradicate it as if it never existed. And we see it now once again with this whole like, oh, Beyonce, right? I know when I had a little critique on IG about Cowboy Carter, Beehive ate me up. And I was just very confused by that, because I'm like, this woman is literally on a horse with the American flag. Like, how more nationalist can you get? And how more patriotic can you get, right? And now I'm seeing like photos of people at like these rallies for Kamala wearing like the American flag, right? Like it's like the end thing now, and it's just very scary. Because once again, like the propaganda is working. And instead of uplifting folks such as like Audre Lorde or like Toni Cade Bambara or June Jordan or Barbara Smith, or even like Joel Gomez, Cheryl Clark, Pat Parker, who was also a former Black Panther Party member, which a lot of people do not know that. But instead of uplifting these people and like, putting these folks in like our curriculums in school, they would rather teach us about the Condoleezza Rice. They would rather teach us about, oh, the lady, her name is escaping me right now, but she's in California in Congress. Oh, Maxine Waters, right? They would rather teach us about all these people who are literally committed to empire, who are literally committed to imperialism, who are literally committed to being friggin' just the Black misleadership class, and then they want our young folks to model themselves after that, because they know that if they have access to these texts that critique empire, that critique imperialism, that actually challenge folks to think critically and deepen that skill of critical thinking, then the existence of the empire and imperialism will not be very long. It'll be short-lived, and it may even, be dismantled in our lifetimes. So yeah, that is my piece on that. And thank you once again, Comrade Ivy.
Thank you so much, Angel. Always so astonished by your analysis. And I would be remiss not to shout out Tumblr Hive in the chat. I too was a Tumblr baddie back in the day. It was a time. Really grateful for I feel like it was my pre-radicalization. I wouldn't say it was like full radicalization. I definitely have grown significantly in my politics since then. But I do think that I have a theory about like the social media websites that you gravitate towards and your eventual radicalization. And I think Tumblr is like number one on like bringing people away from liberal thinking. So thank you so much, Angel, for bringing a wonderful and like now not completely defunct, but basically defunct social media platform into the space. This next question is for Monaye. In many ways, like we just talk like a skosh about like how Black feminism and anti-imperialist feminism is distorted by the state in our current movements. Obviously, that has a very, very large impact on the state's response to Black feminism. So, like with each new co-optation, I guess, like basically the state is very clear about how it's triangulating our movements. As Black feminists, we understand the challenges of remaining committed to Black feminist work while simultaneously trying to live our lives day to day. And essentially, we're at war with capitalism. and neoliberalism as an extension of capitalism can be extremely enticing. So as an organizer and a reproductive justice worker and a practicing June Jordan scholar, you've shared a lot of necessary critiques regarding Black feminism and the ways we are like basically essentially what happens when we're not careful or willing to commit to the work that's necessary to like unsuture ourselves from the empire. And there are many industries that are complicit in this practice, but could you share with us about the consolidation of Black feminism within the nonprofit industry?
Okay. Yeah, where do I want to begin? I think the opening question was like, what do we think Black feminism is? And if I were to say what I think Black feminism is, I think that it is an inquiry into the question of like, what is patriarchy? And I think to understand patriarchy, it gets you to questions about gender. However, I think that a feminist project or a Black feminist project is not inherently a gender project, right? And there are some people who would argue that Black feminism shouldn't even be a gender project, but I'm not going to go that deep into it. So I think Black feminism is concerned with the question of patriarchy. I think where we all disagree and where we land differently is how we get to that question. There are many people within Black feminisms who think you only have patriarchy because of colonialism. There are many people who have different types of arguments, right? We don't all agree on patriarchy, but I think that what separates Black feminism from a lot of other frameworks or movements is that there is still that question of patriarchy, or at least we don't want to forget that that is also something that we want to dismantle. And I think it's really, really important to keep that. I think that one of the most beautiful things about feminism in general is that it's also concerned with the private and the public sphere. However, I also think that's its downfall. I think that a lot of people stay in the private sphere. And I think that a lot of people romanticize it. And so what I think happens is that we get a lot of, I think even Bell Hooks talks about like lifestyle feminism, right? And so if feminism and Black feminism specifically was supposed to be this consciousness raising project that gets you to a particular political orientation so that you are ready to resist something because you then know what you are resisting. If you only stay in that private sphere, then of course you're only concerned with upward mobility, right? Like that to me is a natural 1 + 1 = 2. And so I think that as power or class within the United States has changed, right? Because we're not living in the same reality that our ancestors were living in. That's why this movement is so different. I think we have to honor that. This is one of the first times in history where people actually truly believe a Black woman can sit in the highest office. That's why they acting like dodo heads, right? Because they are like, oh, actually, we can be at the table. And so they missed the consciousness raising sessions on what the table actually was. And I think that a lot of people, when it comes to Black feminism, because they associate it with any gender project, then anybody is a Black feminist, right? We really messed up when we said that one, right? We said feminism is for everybody, and then now we're saying any and everybody is a Black feminist. So I think that in order to deal with the capture that is happening with Black feminism, we also have to go back and see like what and where we got things wrong. I think that's really, really important, right? That's why so many of us have been talking about the difference between identity of politics and identity reductionism, right? But it's not enough to give people different definitions if within previous, current, and future projects, we are not helping people tease out these distinctions. The difference between, I think, what a lot of people have named today and what's happening in the nonprofit world is they are willing to be agents of the states, but they still have June Jordan on the wall, right? Like that's like the other people are studying the Condoleezza Rices and they're skipping the figures we're naming. the capture in the nonprofit world, they know all of this. And we have to compare that to Obama and Kamala, because those are also people who are reading the same books as us, right? We know who raised Kamala. We know that Barack reads the same things as us. And so if we know that, then we also have to think about what, like, we know what the function of the nonprofit is. We know that they're reading the same things as us. And so it's really clear. It's not that they don't know, it's that they truly want that seat at the table. They want it. And for some people, I think there's a willful ignorance there. Well, maybe they think they can make the table do something differently. But I'm going to be really honest. I don't know if I believe that anymore. I think these people know what that table does and they want to do it. They want to do it. And I think that one of the things that a lot of folks say is like, we need a material analysis. We need a material analysis. That's why there's so many gaps. Those people have a material analysis. The material analysis is the stock market for them. It's buying a house for them, right? Like it's all the things that they now have an entry point into. And so that gets me back to Black feminism has to be able to, one, reorient people to move away and beyond the self. I got that from Jennifer Nash. It also has to make itself irresistible to co-optation. There's no way that we can do that without deeply contending with the vanguards of our current movement. We haven't actually figured out how to do that. And what's standing in between us is funding, differences in funding, right? Some of us are funded, some of us are not. Some of us are in the academy, some of us are not, right? But I think that co-optation is possible when you romanticize the private sphere and you don't ever think that you get where I'm going with this. I'm really trying to keep it chill. I'm kind of keep it chill, but I'm gonna stop there. But like that's really what I think has happened. How do we have so many Black feminist organizations on a national scale that can total nearly $50 million within their budgets combined, and we have no national direct service programs? The everyday Black person has not felt us in their lives. When Black people can get up and say, I'm voting for Donald Trump because he gave me that stimmy, we got to actually listen to what they're saying. They're saying that this touched my material life. And therefore, I am pledging some sort of allegiance to that. They can't pledge to us because we haven't touched their material lives. We've webinared them out. We've conferenced them out. So we have to get back to serious projects. That's the only way you resist co-optation, in my opinion. Is the project serious? Or is it a photo op? We need to agree on what the project is. And I also think that like we also need to stop overstating the project, right? Because this question of I'm not a liberal Black feminist, I'm a revolutionary Black feminist. You may be in rhetoric. Have you picked up the gun? Like I'm calling us all in this moment, myself included, right? Because for me, what Empire has taught me is there's no rhetoric, there's no conference, there's no rally, there's no slogan stronger than a bomb. And so if we are really going to put these terms on us beyond the consciousness raising side, what is the project? And for a lot of us, I think a lot of people are not actually willing to devote themselves to a global type of solidarity project that is material and is against empire. Because when you do that, there is no invitation to the White House. There is no funder. I would even argue there's really no place in a program because the board of directors is not going to have you either. So like we're talking about something completely different. And so I'm going to stop there because, you know, I'm under several NDAs and I can't say anything else.
Devastating. Absolutely devastating. Hmm. I can't move on just yet. I don't know about y'all. I need a moment to let that just sit on me because I haven't picked up the gun. You're absolutely correct. It's me. Um, Thank you, Monet. Because I think that you said the quiet part out loud, and I know that all of us know the quiet part. I think that if you have made it here, you know the quiet part, right? Um, but to say it plainly, yes, I think that this working definition, one, the question like that Black feminism is supposed to bring us with gravitas to the question of what is patriarchy, and more importantly, what are we going to do about the manifestation of patriarchy that is empire? Like those are the questions. So thank you so much for that. Concise. You said that you went too long, but that was concise. Yeah, what a blessing. So generous. I have another question for Jaylani, if that is all right with the broom. Uh, so Jaylani, you have taken great measures to commit to the work of reproductive justice and helping us understand the language of law, not just for Black women, not just for the cis ones, not just for those who are women, but for all Black people. You shared with the Gender and Sexual Justice Committee a few weeks ago, before this event. If we don't reclaim liberal feminist ideals of reproductive justice and reconnect with decolonial feminist lineages, that we are complicit in the violence of the United States abroad. Can you speak about the urgency of reclaiming ideas of reproductive autonomy and body sovereignty from a liberalized feminist framework, particularly since the US weaponizes LGBTQ plus rights and justice and women's rights and gender justice to justify racial capitalism and imperialism?
Absolutely. So, I'll just start that storytelling is really valued in RJ movement spaces. And so I'll just start by sharing a very little piece of like why I came to RJ, why that's been the cornerstone of a lot of my work. And so I'll just say that I came to RJ in the wake of a campus sexual assault in 2016. And as you can imagine, thinking about the political climate at the time, thinking of what organizing I would have encountered between like 2012 to 2016, I knew that I was not going to the police about it. And like it wasn't because I was an abolitionist at the time. Like I really would not say that I was a radicalized person. I was just a very practical person. I was not going to the police about it. That said, like I still had a very basic need for and like desire for aftercare, right? Like I wanted a pregnancy test. Depending on the outcome of that test, I wanted an abortion. I wanted STI testing, potentially treatment there, and so on and so forth. And so I was able to access that healthcare because of RJ-centered student organizing on my campus that made it so that there was free sexual and reproductive health services that were available to me. And then I was also able to rely on friends at the time who were willing to walk with me to get those services because I also was like going to a clinic when there are all these old white men in Long Island screaming at you is like not something that I thought I could handle at the time. And so like I share that story because I personally like I believe very deeply in reproductive justice as a framework for organizing against white supremacist patriarchy. Like I've experienced the life-saving impacts of communities who are organized around that. And I've also been part of that life-saving force for other people and being organized around that. And that said, like my belief in reproductive justice is why over this past almost a year in particular, I felt so angry with the state of the reproductive justice movement in the US. And just as more time passes, I also become really disappointed and saddened by it. And the fact that there is this misleadership that is very often like whispered about privately, but it's not critiqued openly or directly. And like again, like we're to Jaleesa being here because I had a really cathartic interaction with him about this like last week or the week before. So just naming that they're in the space. But I use misleadership really intentionally and like I know what the word means and that's why I use it. because I really do see it as leaders and people of great influence in our movement misguiding and misdirecting people, whether that's what they believe they're doing or not. And so as an example of it, in July for The Cut, they published an interview with Loretta Ross as one of the, co-coiners of reproductive justice. And in that article, she says, it's so delicious to have a prosecutor running against a felon. It's not just about identity, it's about experience. Someone who upholds the law versus someone who tries every means to break it. And I'll put it in the chat because I'm like one of the auditory processing girlies who benefits from things being in the chat. But my introduction to reproductive oppression inside of prisons and jails in the US and elsewhere was through the work of Sister Song, which Loretta Ross co-founded. And so my commitment to abortion seekers in the US South in particular has only deepened that commitment to incarcerated people. And it's also why I really don't shy away from, I'm not scared to embrace the incoherence that's inherent in like illegal felon and law and order. Prosecutors have always been an enemy to reproductive justice. That's never been in dispute as a very just practical matter, like thinking about the prosecutors who very zealously went after pregnant people who were using drugs, particularly cocaine at the height of the war on drugs in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. And then the prosecutors of today who are collaborating with Meta, with abusive husbands and boyfriends, with spiteful neighbors, and so on, to target pregnant people, their friends, their families, and other people who are helping them get abortions. And so upholding the law has always meant demonstrating a very blatant disregard for people's well-being and dignity at the very least. Like, that's what the law does. That's why a quote-unquote felon can run for president at all, right? Like, the law is twisted and contorted to rationalize white supremacist patriarchy. And so then you have the coexistence of the realities of the incarcerated people that we love, that we organize with, and then this felon, quote unquote, Donald Trump, who like his felonies are just the butt of a joke at the DNC, right? Like, he's not experiencing the realities of incarceration that our comrades are. And he won't. Like, we've seen, he's running for, like, I have never seen a felony mean what it means for Donald Trump in my life. And so right now, to me, the people who are willing to and have broken the law are the people who are safeguarding that Black radical lineage that reproductive justice comes from. The people who are being beaten by police, who are facing felony charges, who are risking employment, who are never, like Monaye was mentioning, who are never going to see like a White House Christmas party, who aren't going to be friends with celebrities. Those are the mothers of my movement, like, respectfully. Like that, like when I think that we need to also be very much less liberal with who we allow to really hold that role of mother, of being, an ancestor and an elder. You do not get to just be old and experience oppression. Like, I started with my story because it's important for my location within reproductive justice, but I don't get to just say I believe in reproductive justice because I have benefited from labor that other people have done. Like, that's just not what it means. The same way that I don't get to be a Black radical feminist just because I'm Black and I'm coded as a woman in most spaces. Like, that's not what it means. That means that I'm Black and coded as a woman in most spaces. Like, we already have words for that. And so what the misleadership of the movement has done over the last year is really consent to the weaponization of this cause, and is consenting to, particularly the sitting presidential administration and Vice President Harris, should she become president, her administration, against those people who are attempting to hold this country and its institutions, to the fire for its role in genocide, occupation, exploitation all over the planet. And so I think that given that, like, we're at a really, to me, indescribable moment in this movement, because I think that it's such a glaring contradiction. Like, we have these Black women who said, let's sit down and build reproductive justice, because this liberal, pro-choice, pro-life movement is not doing it. They're not hearing us. They don't want to hear us. They're telling us to shut up because we're at the Clinton, convening, and they want that healthcare plan to go through. And now we're telling decolonial feminists, we're telling Palestinians who are seeing thousands of their loved ones killed every day, shut up. Like, we have a Black woman who's going to be president. Like, be quiet. I don't understand, because we're talking to the co-coiners of the framework. So they were not just alive to witness it. Like, they coined it and now are like, be quiet. Now, I'm sure those white women had a really good reason for why they're excluding us, right? And now those Black women have a really good reason why they've decided to sell out the movement for the invite to the Christmas party or to sit down with Chrissy Teigen and talk about her lived experiences. Like, I'm sure everyone has a really good reason for why they do what they do. They have really great reasons. There's strategy involved. There's 10-year plans. There's all the things. Everyone has a reason for why they do what they do. But in that, like, I think the movement has lost a lot of legitimacy, and I don't know what it looks like to get that back. I don't know. Like, from a place of rage, go back and forth of, do I say, we let it go, like we lost legitimacy and we allow like it to sunset and that's it? Or, do we fight for the heart of this movement, acknowledge missteps really openly, and then model what it means to kind of return to that track of this Black radical tradition? I think there are arguments for both. I'm in both camps by the start of the week to the end of the week sometimes. But I know that what we can't do is continue to just carry water for the Democratic Party. That hasn't done anything for us either. Like, I think that there's something really, really devastating to see it done, particularly when this presidential administration came in. We had people, counting how many days it had been before, President Biden would say the word abortion. Why am I carrying his water? He would not spit on me if I was on fire. He probably set the fire. What am I talking about? What am I asking him for help for? And so I really, really just, as much as I believe in this, and I think that my work speaks to it, I think that we're at this moment where we really have to decide if we believe in reproductive justice or not. And if we don't, I don't think that necessarily means the work stops. We're no longer grounded or rooted in this radical tradition. But if we want something else to exist, if we really want to be students of the moment, then we need to also acknowledge the missteps that we're a part of. And I think a lot of that goes to what Monaye was just saying around the ways that the nonprofit industrial complex has also captured what it means to be involved in the movement and is intentionally distancing itself from criminality, from what it means to be a common criminal, trying to really draw these distinctions between abortion seekers who are criminalized and criminals and incarcerated people, as though there is something that's lost if we do admit that we are engaging in criminal conduct, depending on the day. And so I really just want to see, RJ get it together. I know that like self-critique and self-reflection can be really scary, because like the things that we're fighting haven't stopped. Like it's not like we can take a real pause and say, let's sit down, and then everything kind of just resume after. Like, I know that feels scary because it means you're not, quote unquote, doing anything. But what we're doing is very violent. So I would rather not do anything if the alternative is to do the violent things that we're engaged in. And so I'll leave it there.
Standing. And so thank you so much for your vulnerability and sharing with us like kind of the genesis of your entryway into this work. And more importantly, being honest about like the limits of the framework, the name, the brand, like I myself sometimes find that like sometimes I don't know what to call myself. Like I don't know what to like label myself as to make myself legible. And then I realize that like I don't actually need to label myself. I need to do the fucking work. Like the work needs to get done. Like that's who I am. The work is who I am. With that being said, have one final question, with the hopes that Monaye will pop in again, but like truly want each and every one of y'all's beautiful brains to be in the mix on this, to be completely honest. I'm gonna start out with quotes just like the previous questions. Black feminist, anti-imperialist writers Erica Edwards, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and most recently, Marina McGlure have both written about the conflict and struggle between June Jordan, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, and others over the concern of Zionist feminism. McGlure writes, in Moving Towards Life, like Lorde, we find Jordan amid the rubble, but in the latter's case, it is her material presence, her sneakered feet, her hand clasping a camera, her yellow legal pad dutifully documenting the martyrs and those who survived. She was not content to merely lament Palestinian death from afar. She wanted to sit in the living room they created atop the ruins. I watched a woman setting out a jasmine plant that would probably manage the atmosphere and possibly flourish. Jordan's model of solidarity is as arduous as the slow growth of this embattled jasmine, and it goes far beyond the cessation of genocide. If, as Jordan has it, the issue of the Palestinian people is the issue of the value of human life, Jordan teaches us to move towards life. And while it's easy to focus on the conflict within itself, the Gender and Sexual Justice Committee invites all of us to consider what happened through the framework of principled struggle. Ultimately, June Jordan and other Black feminists struggled to move toward an anti-Zionist and anti-imperialist form of Black feminism. Our own organization has a history over the last few years. We've reconsidered our positions along the lines of Black gender and sexuality. It was a necessary struggle that enabled us to create the Gender and Sexual Justice Committee, which was created as an accountability measure to ensure that our national membership upholds our sixth principle, which is to end the gender and sexual oppression of our people. Principled struggle is necessary for any grassroots organization or organizer committed to the liberation of our people. Currently, one of the major issues of the pending US federal election is that on Palestine, as some Black feminists may or may not acknowledge what is happening in Palestine or the non-US Black world as important to the US. It's critical for us to remain principled as we discuss harm, conflict, the things that frustrate and disappoint us, and the ways we can push one another past our comforts. As Black radical feminist scholars, what words would you give to other Black radical feminists or aspiring Black radical feminists on addressing conflict and principled struggle during a time such as this? And honestly, just would love to hear y'all share what it means to remain in principled struggle with one another as Black radical feminists.
Such a timely question. What comes up for me when I hear that question, I think about my own consciousness raising and like how I've been politicized over the years. I'm very honest with people that like I didn't start from this point. And that's why I'm so devoted to political education, because there were Black feminists along the way who struggled with me, right? Interpersonally, politically, the whole 9 yards. It took work to get me from a place where at 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, I identified as a Democrat to like where I am now, right? Like that took struggle. And I think that in order to remain in principled struggle, one of the things that this is just me talking, but one of the things that we really have to do is we really have to do our interpersonal work and understand our internal script, right? We're not in this to just solely heal ourselves, and so we go around emoting and calling it analysis. For me, principled struggle is about understanding why we do this work, what the project is, and calling people in when they stray too far away from said project. That to me is what it really has to be. I think we need to separate principled struggle from just what is just interpersonal conflict. Like those have to be two completely different things. And you're only going to really be able to point that within yourself if you understand your internal script. And that to me, again, goes back to what I said about like one of the powers of Black feminisms is this inquiry in the personal as the political, the private and the public sphere, right? I think you have to be able to do both in order to stay engaged in principled struggle. You need to be able to understand what a person actually said to you, what was actually done versus what is coming up for you. Because the coalition and the political home can't help you with everything that is just coming up for you. We have to learn that. We also have to understand in order to be in real principled struggle, we have to have a power analysis because all critique isn't equal. A critique leveraged against the class of EDs is not the same as two comrades in a political home. Those are different. We owe each other different things in those moments. And I think that's also important. we also just have to be able to tell, is this my ego and my self-righteousness? Because none of us are above that, regardless of the politic you use or hide behind, depending on who you are, you're not above those things, right? This work can induce straight up psychosis if you aren't careful. I really do believe that. And so I think in order to engage in principled struggle, there's just a level of interpersonal work that you got to be willing to do. And there's a devotion and a commitment to material analysis and a power analysis that has to happen. You may feel like I hurt your feelings because you occupy a certain position of power and I critiqued you. That is not the same as me actually hurting you. Those two things are completely different. So I think, again, going back to like, are you doing your work? And then 2, do you have a power analysis? And 3, what is the project that you're even critiquing? What is the critique for? Because I think we've all, those of us who've been in political homes before, we've also seen them blow up because of too much struggle where we thought the comrades were the base and we forgot that the community was actually the base. So I think it's really hard, but I really do think it's checking that ego, having that power analysis, and also not thinking that you are ever above becoming damn near a Kamala. I'll say it, because she started out as somebody with a Marxist text in front of her too. So if we understand that, we want to be in principled struggle because we don't ever think that we are outside of the possibility of doing harm or straying away from the project. And one thing we know about empire is it's enticing. It captures not just our movements, but our desires, our weaknesses, our material needs, our everything. It's enticing. It's hard to want to be here when it looks like the other side has what could help you and your family today. And so we have to constantly reground ourselves in what is the project so that we are not enticed. And I'll stop there because I really want to hear what the rest of you have to say.
Well, I mean, I feel like you said it all. And I'm going to try to make this as concise as possible because my laptop is dying and I cannot find my charger for some reason. But as someone who was a part of that process with MXGM and our creation of the Gender and Sexual Justice Committee, that was honestly my first time engaging in actual principled struggle. And it was hard. I was not used to that. I was used to being like this angsty, reactionary person on the internet, like just like yelling my thoughts into a void. And so when this conflict, no, these differences came up, I was like, whoa, like, can I do this? Should I just like walk away? But thankfully for my comrades, right, helping me through it and teaching me what actual principled struggle is, it really made me more committed to the work. And also just learning just how like critique, like constructive criticism, principled criticism, right? I think about the Black Liberation Army's explanation of criticism, where it's unity, criticism, unity. And we have to treat this as something that is a tool of accountability, but also a tool that'll help us to transform ourselves, right? I think about the personal as political a lot. And it's like if we're just studying, regurgitating what it is that we're studying, but we're not actually putting it into praxis in every aspect of our lives, then what's the point? Like I feel like those are the armchair revolutionaries. And yeah, we have to also, once again, like differentiate, like what is conflict, right? What is harm? What does that look like? And I also think having like a common understanding and consensus on what it is that we're going to tolerate. Like, are we going to tolerate anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric within this organization, or are we not? Like what is our line? And I think it has just been a very humbling and also informative experience, just bearing witness to the growth of an organization such as Malcolm X Grassroots movement, who's been around for almost 35 years, right? Like I'm not trying to like, boast and brag, but I don't really see a lot of organizations who are similar to ours doing this type of work. And I think that it is much needed, and it is very important. And, you know, when we have these critiques, like we also have to engage in self-criticism as well. Like we're also not above that, right? Like just because I may be able to explain like what New Africanism is maybe just because I know how to explain like anarchism doesn't mean that I'm above the trappings, right? And the seduction, like Monaye said, of empire, right? Careerism, upward mobility. I think about Tony K. Bambara's quote, which I try to recite to myself like every day, is I must make revolution irresistible, right? And how do I do that? How do I make sure that my words are political, so that they not only help me to make sense of what it means to be in protracted principle struggle, but also others who may be having these questions. Um, and yeah, I don't think that we should we should take like criticism as like this attack on us as people. But how can we use it to change? How can we use it to transform? Because I didn't get to where I am by myself. Like there were people along the way, whether they're in my life now or not, who helped me to be who I am now. And I know that this is not like my final form. I still have so much more growing and transformation to do. And so I am just grateful to be with folks who are helping me through this.
No. Not the laptop cut my dog off. That's sad.
I had forgotten all about it because I was like, wow, the things you're saying are so beautiful. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot we really were on like a time crunch.
Fuck. Hopefully they can rejoin via like mobile or something. But for now, Chrystel or Jelani, please feel free to hop in.
Yeah, I love everything that has been said. I especially want to emphasize what Monaye said about nobody is above being Kamala, because I think that's a very, very important aspect of things. Thinking about cooptation as something that nobody is above, and especially I think there has been a lot of discussions about figures that people were thinking were radicals, and then something comes up, and then there's this like disappointment with this figure and this kind of like discard. And I think it kind of reflects a kind of like market approach to people in movements as well, where it's like either like wholesale adoration or like wholesale rejection, and which goes to like a kind of like celebrity, the impact of like celebrity culture in organization spaces. But I do think for me, it's more productive to think about cooptation as something that we resist as collectives rather than something that we resist as individuals. And I do think that the individual level is always a trap. And there's this like French collective that's called Case Rebelle, who has this article, We Don't Need Other Heroes, but that talks a bit more about this kind of like this figure approach to movements and how problematic it is. And the second thing I would say is also to think about change. The kind of like, what I appreciate about this Magloire article is those positions shifted because those people were in community with each other and were friends. And I think it's always something that's like super important, because I see a lot of people not having difficult conversations at home or with friends or with people that are actually in their lives, but shouting on the internet or shouting in the streets at other people. And I don't think that you convert strangers. I think you convert people you're actually in community with and spend time with and have actual deep relationship with. And I don't think that arguing with like closeted Republicans or like strangers online is actually doing anything. So thinking about this relationship and this kind of like intimate scale as something that needs to be invested, And the last thing that I need to say, because I've had personally, I won't go into detail, but I've had a lot of knee-jerk reactions as to how places like Congo or Sudan or even Haiti come up right now in conversations as this kind of like, and I'm going to say it in a very brutal way, but this kind of like neoliberal distraction tactic from Palestine by people who oftentimes are not really invested in actual liberation in those places. And I have to say that we need to be very conscious of the fact that humanitarianism is actually not solidarity. And those things are two very different things. And especially when it comes to Congo or Sudan, like when people's messaging starts to resemble UNICEF campaigns, I think we've lost the plot. And when revolution work becomes like GoFundMes, letting humanitarian cargoes pass and all of those things, like, and how all of those things are also part of like sorry, I'm losing my words, but the kind of like sanitization of a movement. I'm really thinking about this kind of like transition for Palestine where you have this like image of like people breaking through like prison gates and like all of those like liberals being like so scared. And suddenly you have this language of humanitarian crisis and Palestinians as victims and humanitarian victims. And of all of those liberals are in support of like a ceasefire and all of that like sanitization language that is not about actual liberation. But yeah, just to say that like, I think we need to be very, very careful about how saviorism, humanitarianism kind of always threatens our solidarity movements and like who are we actually in solidarity with? Like, are we in solidarity with NGOs, nonprofits, or actual militants and freedom fighters in those places? Like, who are we talking to from Congo, from Sudan, or from Haiti, or from Palestine?
Thank you so much, Chrystel. In saying that, we want to make sure like we're asking who we're in solidarity with. Yeah, who we're in solidarity with. I think we would be super remiss if we didn't reference Black trans-feminism in a conversation like this. So really quickly, before I ask Jaylani to like, provide us with even more brilliant analysis, I'm just going to read a quick excerpt and then ask another question that is super open to everyone, and then we'll get into the Q&A. I know we're running a little close to time, but just wanted to make sure that we got this in. Adapted from a 2022 roundtable session titled For the Dolls, Toward a Trans Femme of Color Theory at the annual meeting of the National Women's Studies Association in Minneapolis, Eric Zhang, and featuring Julian Kevin Glover, Ava L. J. Kim, Tamsin Kimoto, Nathan Alexander Moore, Erica Jordan, Hollis O'Neill, and Lavelle Ridley published their conversation for the Transgender Studies Quarterly called A Tranifesto for the Dolls. Nathan Alexander Moore stated, Black normative gender performance is one way that Black beings have attempted to lessen the violence that began with the transatlantic slave trade. I'm going to say that again. Black normative gender performance is one way that Black beings have attempted to lessen the violence that began with the transatlantic slave trade. What I find most interesting is that gender, and more particularly maleness or masculinity, have been the key to thinking through one's emancipation. In thinking of Black trans feminine subjects, we are the ones who were wrongly assigned male at birth and have chosen to embrace ourselves and come to this challenge to reckon with ungendering. If maleness and masculinity have meant one vector through which attempts at freedom have been actualized, then perhaps it is productive that we think about how femaleness, femininity, and specifically Black trans femininity is a space that ruptures these attempts, that unsettles the linear progression from enslaved fungible flesh to Black normatively gendered citizen. Black trans femininity both moves with the weight of history while at the same time pointing us toward those uncharted territories for more livable futures. In this way, Black trans femmes might be conceived as walking ruptures of temporality and the supposedly stable geographies of normative gender. I want to propose Black trans femininity as a space of rupturing, an opening up and a pulling apart of the social fabric, a rendering of our discursive lexicons, and the productive unsettling of our imaginaries. Considering Moore's thinking regarding this rupture by way of trans femininity, what is the danger in only recognizing Black radical feminism as a practice and consideration of the cis Black woman? And how should we, as Black radical feminists, commit to framework of ungendering that not only recognizes the work of Black trans feminists, but also engages the practices of Black trans feminism? Jaylani.
What a question. I think that there's a really good example of how Black normative gender performance being this way of people trying to lessen the violence that begins with the transatlantic slave trade in the Black feminists, who I think, in particular, whenever there's the Olympics or like another big sporting event, end up trapped in this performance of really trying to legitimize like what is Black, Arab, African, and other colonized peoples, like what is that womanhood? It has integrity, and really trying to defend it. And I know that it comes from, for at least some of these individuals, like a really genuine place of, like feeling hurt that this is something that's going to be litigated over and over again. Like I truly understand that and don't want that to be lost. That said, like I have found more comfort and resolve in this promise of gender self-determination that's provided through Black trans feminism than I have in trying to fight for my right to access any kind of gender performance that's been imposed on me instead, because that's why it's imposed on us. It's not something that we can organically or self-determine ourselves within. And so to simplify it, but not to oversimplify it, I think that Black trans feminism has, over the last few years in particular, really invited a lot of Black feminists to like look around and realize that like we're on a treadmill, actually. Like we're running as hard as we can, but we're on a treadmill. And so we can actually just step off. Like we actually don't have to, every time J.K. Rowling or some other white woman from wherever decides to scrutinize, a womanhood because of the color of the skin of the woman, like we don't have to do that. We can get off the treadmill and say, instead of, breaking a sweat here and doing this every month or every 6 months or whatever it is, I actually can do something else. Because like I think the tragic part of it is that if we are so exhausted from doing that over and over again, really trying to defend this, we can't do anything else. And like the fact of, cis sexism and trans misogyny, like it remains. Like we're exhausted when we get there. Like we've done something, like we've been putting our energy towards something, but it was not ultimately the thing that was going to be the most fruitful. And so I think that engaging with Black trans feminism is going to require a lot of Black radical feminists to really embrace the rupture that Black trans femininity represents, instead of trying to, force our bodies and our realities to fit inside of something that was imposed upon us to begin with. And I really want us to think of these ruptures as opportunities to really rethink and expand opportunities for liberation, to really push beyond normative gender and really imagining what it means for us to articulate our own gender at this stage. And like, I know that for some folks, like that might feel really difficult because I think it's really easy to be trapped into like really reactionary debates where you're not going to win them. As somebody who's also on the internet, I am often trapped in reactionary shit that I do not want to be in. And you don't realize that you're in it until you're in it. And now you're like, well, now I got to keep going because I've been going back and forth for so long. Now I got to finish it. Like, I'm a Leo. Like, what do I look like? Not finishing. We already been going back and forth. Now I'm in it. But like, it is a treadmill. Like, we could just get off and actually run somewhere. And then I'll sit in a circle and be like, all right, we all ran somewhere. We're here. We're aligned. Like we can really shift things. Or we could just stay on that treadmill and be like, I'm exhausted. I haven't gone anywhere. This is ground that I felt beneath my feet before. And I'm exhausted. Or we can step up. And like I really have found so much closure in saying I actually don't have to sit here and legitimize why I'm in the space that I'm in. And I think trans feminism too, like part of what's been so liberating about it is getting to actually decenter gender, which might feel like very confusing when you're like, this is actually what I'm seeking, but like really getting to focus on patriarchal violence in a way that's not centering gender, or that's not seeking coherence through saying, okay, so I'm talking about womanhood, obviously. And so everybody else who experiences what I've allowed womanhood to mean is experiencing it in this like trickle down way. Like I'm talking about patriarchal violence. So I don't need everybody to be a cis woman. I don't need everybody to even just be a woman. Like I then leave so much space to talk about racialized masculine performances, which I think can be really captured by very reactionary and misogynistic groups of thought because they're relying on talking about masculinity being incoherent within Black feminism when that's never really been the case. But I think that would take us in another part of the conversation, so I'll leave it there.
Truly outstanding. Wow. I'm overjoyed, to be completely honest. This panel has been a magnificent experience for me. Selfishly, I cared about how I felt after this, and I'm so glad to be in shared space and like to really just be able to like speak about something that has been overshadowed, something that I think all of us believe that this is central to our collective liberation, but it has been overshadowed by other formations, other movements, other loud and wrong factions among us. I think we have one question from the chat. If I know that Chrystel might have to hop off immediately, so just want to say thank you so much to Chrystel for your time, for your expertise, for your words, for the references. It's really just thank you. Yeah, just thank you so much for your time and generosity. And I think Z is gonna ask the question.
Ooh, y'all, my God. That's all I gotta say is my God. So I'm not even going to belabor the point. We have one question. I didn't see any other questions, but we have one question for all of you as panelists from Casey. They ask, how does artistry and storytelling lend itself to that danger in terms of keeping Black feminist traditions dangerous? How do we make a gun out of our creative work?
I can make an attempt. Yeah, just because I brought up storytelling earlier and I've shared parts of my story too. I think that storytelling is something that can very easily just become like why a lot of folks are engaging in like identity reductionism, because a lot of folks are saying like, okay, like here's story, here's lived experience, here is, you know, like me citing to the racism or whatever it is that I've experienced, and here's why I get authority in this space. Which in some spaces, depending on who you're with, maybe that makes sense strategically to say what you need to say. But I don't think generally that does our stories honor too. Just because like for me, part of why I always share that story for like my entry point into reproductive justice, like is precisely because of the anti-state critique that I make when I tell it in more long form of, I did not get what I needed in the wake of sexual violence from seeking the relief that the state says it can provide for me. Like I was like, the police actually were not part of my story. My, you know, like school was not part of my story. My like grief counselor, people who would report me to the police if I probably really said what I was feeling after myself, they're not part of my story. Like my story is that there were people on my campus who were like, it's really disgusting that we're paying so much to go here and I cannot get healthcare. This should be part of the services here, especially when we consider the red zone that a lot of sexual assault advocates, you know, like talk about of a lot of people experience sexual assault within the timeline that I did. And so these services need to be available and told to students when they get on their campus. That is why I got what I needed. Like it was not because I was able to call the police and be like, this happened to me. And then they were so supportive and so wonderful. And that's how I was able to recover, right? Like the state is not the savior in my story. Now, the state is always framed as the savior when it comes to patriarchal violence in any form. We're always told that like policing is going to fix it, which is why I also had brought up the quote about, it being so delicious that there's a prosecutor running. Like the prosecutor is the villain in every abortion seeker story right now in the US South. Like we're trying to avoid prosecution for providing care, for giving each other abortion pills, for teaching each other how to use abortion pills. There are people being prosecuted for all kinds of things, for desecrating, a body, for like trafficking substances. Louisiana is considering abortion pills to be controlled substances now. So all of that history of drug prosecution now includes abortion pills, right? And so storytelling for me can either be this, oh, I like need an abortion. This is why I'm with her. This is why I'm voting for. It can be that. For a lot of people, it is that. Or it can be where we're finding these critiques and where we're able to really bring people with us to see, like, do you see, like when I say all these things that you're like, what are you talking about? Like, there is no other way. I got to vote this way. Okay, but do you see how, and the things that are already happening to us, the state is not actually touching you in the ways that it's telling you it's touching you. Like it's telling you that you call the police and they will save you. Okay, it's not. It did not do this for me because I'm sure you have tons of other Black folks in your families who have experienced sexual violence and not told anybody. Like we got all kinds of uncles and whoever's that we don't tell anybody about the things that they do. But like that's normal already. So we're doing something else already. So when I talk about abolition or when I talk about carceral feminisms, it's not as big of a jump to folks because they're like, oh, I know what you're talking about. Like, I know you're talking about when me and my friends like beat up the local rapist. Like you're talking about when me and my friends say, so on and so forth. And so I think that that's where art and storytelling can really have so much potential to be part of political education and radicalizing folks versus how it's used a lot of the time to like normalize these things. Because I'm sure that there are folks based on their social location who would have called the police. Maybe that person would have been arrested or not. And that would have been their story. And then that's why you got to donate to whatever campaign. But we as, writers or artists, whatever it is, can also choose to use stories in a very different way.
Oh, that was beautiful. Do we have enough time for me to answer?
We do. We do have one more question. I know that we're running out of time. We're supposed to be ending soon, but go ahead. Go ahead, Monaye.
Okay, sorry. That question for me makes me think of why I wanted to start my blog on Instagram, why I wanted to really think through healing, because the way I was introduced to a lot of storytelling, it was for that sort of kind of purpose. Like, why are you speaking? Why are you telling your story? It was a very interpersonal kind of entry point for me. And it makes me think about June Jordan, where she talks about like the function of poetry. And she kind of says she says something to the effect of like poetry is about actually let me read it. She says it's about the control of like the language in your life. And so I think when I tell a story, I'm thinking about the function of Black feminisms within memory work and like what is memory work actually for. And it for me it's to orient people around something. So for me, storytelling can be healing. However, the language that I want to hold people with is like self-care for fortification, right? Like self-care to stay in the fight. And I think right now a lot of our creative work isn't done to fortify ourselves in order to stay in the fight. It is just escapism. It is just to literally tell the story and be done. And for some people, it's just an entry point into a particular type of marketplace. Like we're not telling the story, we're selling the story. And so I think we have to separate those things. I think for me, each time I have to think about what am I trying to move people towards? And that has to be really intentional because going back to what I said earlier, not everybody's going to pick up the gun, right? I would be lying if I said that that's everyone's role or function or if that's actually what's required of everyone. But I do think that everyone who gives themselves or is given this label of radical Black feminisms has a moral obligation to orient their project around the actual political goal for community, for our people, right? Like I do think that that's important. So I think, how do we make our creative projects not co-opt the language of the movement, but move to people towards that language and towards the end, whether it's towards life, like the article said, or towards a particular type of political orientation. I think that is the most important function. And the trouble is that you have to do that without doing the performance of that. And I think that is what's hard when it comes to our creative projects.
All right, thank you so much, Monet. So we have one more question, and maybe if just one person can answer, that would be beautiful. So, Ines said, I'm curious about the idea of careerism and how you think it's functioning in this context. Grateful for the time, and thank you.
If no one has thoughts on it, I actually have a lot of thoughts on it. I'll try to keep it as concise as possible. Essentially, like careerism is like the prioritization of like upward mobility, particularly in a professional context. So for some people, that'll mean, going from, an hourly worker to a shift manager, from a shift manager to like a full-fledged supervisor, from a supervisor up the chain. And that's more or less like a truism across, and like you start as adjunct, or really started also off as like a graduate assistant, and then you go to adjunct faculty, and then you go to possibly tenure track, or you go from attorney general to state senator to vice president to presidential candidate. Like that's careerism. And I think that one of the things that I'm recognizing, particularly in the kind of class that I was like thrust into as like a first generation college student, is that like many of us are like kind of programmed to see our quote unquote progress in our careers as representative of progress for Black people, which it isn't. Like if I make $100,000 a year, at best, I make $100,000 a year. It like that $100,000 a year doesn't make it very far past my subject position, my family, if I'm being generous. Like it doesn't make it very far. And I think careerism is functioning as low-key an excuse to like be committed to the liberal and imperialist project that is the United States of America. Because like Monet and Ángel and Jelani and Chrystel have said, like the imperialist project of the United States requires our labor, like our complicity. And the justification for a lot of people for not speaking out is the fear of a lack of employment, or the fear of not being able to be upwardly mobile, like to keep it a bean. So like, I think that particularly for artists and academics, because we are positioned as people who quote unquote should know better. I don't know if that phrase actually applies. As y'all know the academics in your world. Y'all know the artists in your world. Because like we are positioned as people who should know better, and people who are supposedly supposed to be like the voices of our communities, the intellectuals of our community, like some of the best representatives of our community. Like it's imperative for our representation not to impede progress for our communities. And I think careerism, like I said, is just like one of the many justifications that people use to like benefit from the work of radical and revolutionary people without actually having to like engage in said work. And it's most certainly used as like a justification for when once someone does make it to a position of power, why that position of power cannot be used to leverage more freedom for Black people, like as a result. Like, well, we got Obama elected, but like we can't expect him to do too much for us because then like white people will be mad. Like we can't expect name literally any Black mayor in a city currently. We can't expect them to like be fighting on our behalf because like in justification, like just because they have progressed in their career does not mean they owe us anything. And yeah, I think that yeah, careerism is just like one of the many justifications that people use to limit their imaginations of what is possible for Black people at large.
All right, thank y'all so much. Thank you so much for just your time. Jaylani, Monaye, and Hel, and Ivy. What I'm going to do is turn everything back over to you.
Yeah, it's a Karja in the building. Or do you want me to close out, Z?
You can close out. Yeah, for sure.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for pulling up. The Gender and Sexual Justice Committee is truly like just like so honored to be able to like hold space for this conversation and to invite so many of our peers and comrades who are just the most like brilliant and generous humans, but also the most committed to the project of liberation for Black, New African, and African peoples. So I just want to say that first and foremost, uh, we cannot close this without a call to action because MXGM is about that work. So this like the Gender and Sexual Justice Committee is seeking other Black radical feminists and womanist political formations, writers, thinkers, creatives, and organizers to build coalition with. Our desire is to consider strategies to build power beyond the federal election structure. If interested, please fill out the form that can be found in the chat and we will contact you with regarding next steps. And in addition to that, we'd love to also uplift the name of one of our political prisoners. Oh, sorry, we also have a study coming through, but I do want to uplift. Are we doing Kamal Siddiqui?
Could you just let them know about the study first and then?
For sure. Yeah, we do have a study coming up. The MXGM Grassroots Liberation School. Would love to see more of y'all's faces and names in this study. Yeah, and that link to sign up for that is in the chat. And last but not least, The Only Solution is released in 2003. One of our comrades, he was sentenced to a life imprisonment for murder and 10 years to run consecutively for armed robbery. Much of his sentence has been spent in a medical prison at the Augusta State Medical Prison in Augusta, Georgia. And because he suffers from Hep C, cirrhosis of the liver, and sarcoidosis, Kamal Siddiqui is now turning 71 years old and is among many other incarcerated elders who suffer in prison from medical neglect. While Kamal has been unjustly imprisoned, his two daughters graduated from college and now have families of their own. In order to address the ongoing medical neglect and wrongful conviction, the only solution is for Kamal to be released. His family has been waiting for a long time to welcome him home. And these are, we'll put links for donations, endorsements, and to help build a Siddiqui squad, which is like helping to build a grassroots movement as a party to MXGM to help organize to get Kamal, Veronta Bowers, like Taliba has posted in the chat, and many others that we need to liberate from their current conditions in the US prison system. And that's it. Again, thank y'all so much to the panelists in particular, but also to all of the participants and folks in the audience. Super grateful to be sharing space and time with y'all, and I hope you have a beautiful night.